Way. So before we get started, I'd just like to say that I sit here tonight on Wurundjeri land and note that others on this online meeting will be possibly sitting in other wide locations. The Red Tag Fly Fishers Club acknowledges the Woiwurrung and Boonwurrung language groups of the Eastern Kulin Nations on whose unceded land we walk and fish. We pay our respects to the ancestors and elders past and present and emerging, and we recognise their continuing connection to land, water and culture. So with that little acknowledgement underway, I'll hand over to Stephen to run through the questions on what should be a very interesting and entertaining evening and discussion around fly fishing in Western Victoria. So Stephen, over to you.
Thanks very much, Andrew. That's great. It's great to see so many people on Zoom this evening. Welcome to Southern, Red Tag, Ballarat, Sunshine members, ACT fly fishers, Calder, Tassie, and all the other fly fishers who've joined us this evening. We'll have our presentation with Phil first, followed by questions. I'll ask you all to mute and keep your questions to the very end. Just pop your questions into the chat section and you'll be invited to unmute and ask a question at that time, if that's okay with you. We'd like to welcome Philip and thank him for joining us on Zoom this evening. So welcome.
Thanks very much, Steve, and everybody.
Yeah, thanks for coming. It's an evening and it's a big sacrifice to come on board. And this is sort of a great event for all of us here and just keeps us in touch with fishing and what's going on with other clubs at the moment. We can't fish, but it's good to hear some of your stories. I'm sure we'll hear some later on this evening. A little bit about Phil. Phil Weigall lives with his partner and 2 sons near Ballarat. He's been fly fishing for over 48 years and guiding for 30 of those. He is a fly fishing guide and instructor at Millbrook Lakes. We've met him several times at Millbrook and he has been a great help and source of information for fly fishing folk on these amazing lakes. When he's not guiding or riding, he tries to get out and fly fish as often as he can. Philip has been writing regularly on all things fly fishing for 31 years. He's the editor of Fly Stream magazine and he's written 10 fly fishing books. Philip is passionate about helping anglers of any level to become better fly fishers. He is well regarded and is published in many forms of media. Fly Fishing Western Victoria is Philip's 10th book. In it, he reveals Western Victoria's reliable trout waters with in-depth information on when they deserve our attention, flies at work, and tips on how to tackle them. Well known for its lakes, Western Victoria arguably offers the Aussie trout angler their best chance at a trophy trout. The lakes are the majority of the story, but the rivers aren't ignored in this book. Overall, this is a book that's essential reading for those entirely new to the area, right through to experienced locals looking for another perspective, or perhaps a new tactic or two to try. Meanwhile, the book's full colour presentation makes it an ideal gift. Before we look at the new book, let's look at how it all began. In the beginning, at some point we started fly fishing, whether it was moving from bait or lure fishing, or from a friend or family member that encouraged us to take up the sport. So Phil, when did you start fly fishing and what inspired you to do it?
Well, Steve, I fell in love with fishing when I was 3, when my Uncle John put me down to the Yarra at Kangaroo Bend where the family had a holiday house, and with a bamboo pole and a worm on the end, I caught an eel. And it's amazing, isn't it? Most people would be conscious that you remember very little around the age of 3, 4, 5, 6. But that is one of 2 or 3 crystal clear memories that I had. So it obviously had some sort of impression. And I then went on, I think the next fish was probably a little 6-inch redfin under Bonnie Doon Bridge when we moved up to the Merrigee area. And then it was spinning and bait fishing for trout in the Delatite, Howker, King and Jamison. And then it was still, I had one vague recollection, the Southern boys will be interested, that Southern fly fishers had a camp on the Delatide at Merrijig every year. And I remember going down and watching, but really just being bewildered by it. It didn't make a great impression. And ironically, it wasn't until we moved down to south of Geelong that I befriended a family that fly fished. The dad fly fished, and the two boys, one slightly older and one slightly younger than me, fly fished as well. And they spun and bait fished at the same time. But Peter Julian in particular was a very keen fly fisher. And long story short, we went on a few trips when I was 10 or 11 years old, and I noticed that Peter sometimes caught more fish, or at least bigger fish, than we caught spinning and bait fishing. So that was when it first dawned on me that maybe I should give this a try. Not for any sort of reasons of aesthetics, but because Peter was catching bigger fish. Oh, and the other thing Peter could do that I couldn't do is he could catch fish during the evening rise, when they must have sort of parted to let the spinner and the worm drift through. So that's how it began for me. And of course, there was probably 6, 7, 8 years where I was doing all three. And then I remember there was a trip, and I wrote in one of my books that I wish I had recorded exactly which trip this was, but I went to either the Jim Crow Creek or the St. George River, and I was doing very well with a little black nymph. And I still spun and I still bait fished. And I remember going one day and thinking, I don't really need to bring the bait rod. Don't need to bring the spinning rod, because I know all I'll do is fish the nymph. So it wasn't a conscious decision, a deep breath where I said, oh, you know, I'm going to tear myself away from these other forms of fishing. It was just a practical decision. And, you know, from that day on, I never brought the spinning rod or bait rod again. I never knew it at the time, but that turned out to be the case. So that must have been probably late teens, early 20s, and that was it. Fly fishing from then on. That was for trout, at least. That was all I did from that point forward.
Fantastic. And the rest is history.
Yes.
You know,
yes.
Some things work out perfectly during a fly fishing trip. Naturally, there are some days when things just don't work out and things go a little pear-shaped. Are there any instances that you recall that are memorable?
Oh, so many. You know, the loss of big fish early are seared into my mind. I've always been very un-David Scholes-like when it comes to losing a decent fish. To this day, I still have a bit of a tanty if I lose a big one. And there's been many, but a couple that stand out was probably the first really big trout I hooked on the Bundara River. Again, you know, probably in that sort of late teens, early 20s, and big trout in the Bundara River still are unusual, but back then we didn't even know they were there. And I had this fish, I suppose it was 4 pounds, and brought it a bit hastily to the net and did the scoop, and had that moment where this horrible moment where the trout's hanging on the outside of the net. So the fly somehow caught the mesh, and there was this sort of moment of no, and I sort of went to do the flip, and of course, too late, it was back in. And the other, there's so many, but the one that really stung many years later was at Bull and Merri, and I'd never caught a big Chinook salmon. And one evening, just to the left of Potts Point, I hooked into this massive Chinook. And I fought it, and I fought it, and I fought it. And they're persistent fish, you know, like they go and they go and they go. That it's not so much their initial power, it's their relentless endurance. And anyway, it was evening, and I got, and Muzz, my good mate Muzz Wilson, pulled up in the car in his old Falcon station wagon, and I thought, perfect timing, you know, he's going to be there to take the photos and everything. And Muzz came down and, oh, you got a nice one there. And I remember I sort of brought it up. I didn't make the same mistake I'd made, you know, 15 years ago on the Bundara. I played it, and I did the careful lift. And I have in my mind its cat eye staring at me. this great big, probably double figure Chinook. And I've just got it in my memory so vividly that it had this odd sort of cat eye that a little different to a trout. And it was staring at me as I sort of drew it towards the net, just came off. Oh. And there was that moment that you have sometimes where you're thinking, but I want it to reattach. I want to, maybe something, it hasn't got off. And of course it had. Mm-hmm. And then a couple of years later, the Chinook salmon production at Snobs crashed. And I did think at the time that may be my only chance, unless I go overseas, to ever catch a Chinook, or a big one at least. Fortunately, they're back on the agenda now. So there's two. I could give you 100, but there's two to go on with.
Yeah. Oh, they're pretty tragic. I think I've had
Yes.
I've had props fall off the motor, all sorts of things.
Yeah. Yes. Oh, we've had on the Great Lake about 2 years ago, our good mate John Savage, who's done round the world yacht races. He's a very competent and nautical boatman. And he was deploying the electric in the middle of the Great Lake, and I mean in the middle, like, many kilometres from shore in probably 20 or 30 foot of water, and he was sort of giving it a bit of a jiggle because it wasn't going down properly, and the mount came off, and John and electric went into the lake.
Oh. I hope he let go.
We saved John. There was a bit of sort of, what Mark and I, my brother, which should we go for? And we thought, I suppose we probably should try and reach in and grab John. And of course, John was fine because unlike 90% of the population, that's the sort of least exciting thing that's ever happened to him, having done the fast net yacht race and things in force 10 gales. Falling over into a sort of mildly choppy Great Lake in summer was nothing, and he soon hauled himself back, but I'm afraid that the motor lies somewhere on the bottom of Great Lake. Yeah. So it was all outboard and drifting after that. Yeah.
Tragic. Very tragic.
Yes.
Millbrook. At some stage, most of us have fished Millbrook. Dotty stick caddis, Millie's midge are just a few flies that come to mind when we fish Millbrook. What are your favourite flies for Millbrook?
Well, the whole subject of favourite flies is a slightly fraught one because they tend to change under the circumstances. But Dotty's scintilla stick caddis is right up there. I think a fly is all the more impressive if you don't have faith in it before you use it, and then you gain faith in it. So if you're convinced from the word go that a particular fly is going to be dynamite, even if you've never used it before, based on, the testimony of other anglers or what your mates have done with it, straight away you're tired on and you're confident. I thought this was the most boring, shitty little fly. And when Dotty gave me a couple to try, I almost did so to humour him. And of course, it's now one of my top 2 or 3 lake fishing flies. I mean, for sight fishing or for presenting to an area where a fish is likely to be, it's one of the best flies there is. And there's a good reason for that. And that is that caddis are a very successful and abundant insect. I mean, we love our mayfly, but mayfly are fussy, There's lots of habitats that mayfly don't work in, especially in Western Victoria. They don't like it too salty. They don't like it too tanniny. There's all these things that mayfly don't like, but caddis, they're tough as, they'll live in seawater, in an estuary, right through, they'll tolerate pollution. And so they're abundant in everywhere from Great Lake to Lake Yukonbean and everywhere in between. They're a very abundant insect. And the irony of Dotty's scintilla stick caddis and a few other stick caddis that are nearly as good is, as boring as they look to us, there are very few flies in our box that are such a perfect copy of the real insect. So that's right up there. Millie Midge is, the only fly I can sort of lay some sort of half credit for having designed, because I actually watched Midge one night at Lake Cancurran and realised that I didn't have anything in my box that had quite the same sort of translucent effect. So that's turned out to be a really good fly at Millbrook, and other people catch fish on it besides me, so I guess it must work. And woolly bugger variants are really good, especially when you're searching the water. You know, you need something that's going to attract the fish. Red buzzers, red super glue buzzer, another ultra boring looking fly that competent fly tyers tell me is almost sort of beneath their dignity to tie. But red super glue buzzers, I'd hate to think how many fish if I find a polaroided fish at Millbrook or in Western Victoria and I want to put a fly to it, it's probably going to be a stick caddis first, and if that doesn't work, it'll be a red super glue buzzer. You know, they're meat and potatoes. They're the things that are just super abundant and available to the trout most of the year and in most lakes.
Mm.
More?
Yeah, no, that's fine. Yeah, they're good flies. Yeah, you've
yeah, and sorry, Steve, and of course, in mayfly time, possum emerges, shaving brushes, skinny brown nymphs, of course, but that's a specific time of year. And so I guess they're not at the forefront of my mind. Maybe if you were talking to me in a month and a half, I would be talking about those flies. It's very important. If you haven't got them in mayfly time, you're in trouble. But the stick caddis, the woolly bugger, and the super glue buzzer I'd feel bereft if I didn't have good versions of each of those in my box, and the millie mids for when they're actually midging.
Yeah, there's a lot to digest there. You've now written 10 books, trout stories.
I have, at last.
Yeah, hit the 10 mark. Well done.
Yeah. I was stuck on the nervous nines for a while.
Oh, well, you ticked it over number 10. Now you've got to tick it over to 100.
Yeah. that might take a while.
A little bit, yeah. So the Call of the River, Trout Stories, Fishing Sense comes to mind as the books you've written. You've contributed countless articles to various magazines, and you're the editor of Flystream. They say a picture paints 1,000 words, and the artworks and photographs are also a feature of your writings. Your books are great to read and difficult to put down once the reading starts. What inspires you to write?
I think the first half of the answer is if you're in love with something like I am in love with fly fishing, you kind of want to share the love, you know? You want other people to feel the same way you do. And so I think that quite simply is the first half of the equation. Many years ago, I had a very kind English teacher who really encouraged me to write, not just essays and things, but I ended up having a couple of things published in youth journals and so forth. So I suppose in my mid-teens, I realised I probably could write. And then, and I devoured stuff. I still do. I have a book on my bedside table permanently, and at least half the time that's probably a fishing book or fishing magazine of some description, because I love reading. So I know how much I love reading, and I used to live for the day that freshwater fishing appeared on the magazine stands. And one time, some friends and I had a trip to Tasmania during the pilot strike. The older members of the audience will remember that. Yeah. And we went down in a Hercules. And I thought to myself when we got back that's probably the makings of an interesting story, that we flew down to Tasmania and back in a Hercules. And we caught some fish, and Tasmania was very new and exciting to me then. It still is exciting, but no longer new. And so I got my dad's typewriter and typed out an article and grabbed some slides that I'd taken and sent them off to freshwater fishing, never expecting really to get a reply. And that it was accepted, and they published it. 1 week in September, I think it was called, back in about 1989. Anyway, so, you know, I was no John Marsden, if it had been knocked back, I would have gracefully accepted it, and I don't think I would have written much. Who knows how life might have turned out, but my sincere feeling is I may never have written another thing again, at least not for publication. But that Bill Klassen accepting that article was the start, you know, and I wanted to write freshwater fishing for a long time, and AFN published my first book, Trout and About, and again, you know, once I submitted a book and it was published, I thought, oh, maybe I can do this again, which it turns out that I could, and that's how it all progressed. So yeah, but I guess the motivation, Steve, is wanting, I guess, to create something, if this doesn't sound too arrogant, that people will enjoy reading as much as I enjoy reading good writers, you know. Because that was just such a highlight of my childhood and my teenage years, and even the first few years when I lived and worked in Melbourne. You know, the great escape was to open a good magazine, you know, Freshwater Fishing, later Fly Life, and the books, you know, David Scholes, Rob Sloane's Truth About Trout, John Guyrak, of course, the international writers, some of the New Zealand writers. And you think, well, gee, wouldn't it be great if I could do something that other people might enjoy as much, or at least not dislike? So that was my motivation, and it's still there. I think guiding really helps too, because from a knowledge point of view, you're constantly reminded about what people understand and perhaps don't understand or manage quite so well. So it's a really happy marriage, guiding and writing, because you're constantly exposed to what a lot of those people out there are thinking, and you know what they find might be a bit difficult and what they might really enjoy. And yeah, I always write for myself first and foremost, because I long ago realized that you can't try to anticipate what other people would like and write accordingly. You know, you've just got to be true to yourself. But at the same time, to experience people's questions and see the things that you think are just second nature, and then you discover that they're actually not. It's a real motivation, especially with books like the one I've just written. You know, you really want to sort of help people on their journey.
Yeah. Thanks, Phil. Your passion means that you've moved around Australia a fair bit. There must be some really good places where you've fished and for some great species. One of your favourite locations for fly fishing is obviously Western Victoria, where you've lived now for almost 25 years. There's a lot of options out there, especially lakes. Which are your favourite, and how do you look at it and fish these lakes?
Well, again, they're sort of like favourite flies. They move around with the seasons, and I often tell people with all sincerity that my favourite water is often the one that I'd really like to fish, but I haven't got there recently. You know, that's the one that I really am most looking forward to going to. But look, just literally off the top of my head, to give you some sort of an answer, I love the Grampians because it's a majestic landscape. You know, favourite waters to me, I love catching fish. Let's be upfront about that, and preferably big ones if I can get them. I'm very shallow in that way. But to give you an example, the Murder Duke, I don't know what you'd call it, assault, frenzy, whatever it was that happened, must be what, early 90s? You know, I had friends catching 10-pound trout, 15-pound trout, 12-pound trout, and they said, you got to get down here. And I just saw their photos of this muddy Maya Creek. I saw the crowds, I heard of the knife fights, I heard of people's lines getting caught on each other. And I just thought to myself, and this is me, you know, each to their own, but I just thought to myself, I don't care how big the trout are. I'm not going there. You know, I'm not interested. So I guess, Steve, that's a way of saying that favourite places to me are at least partly about the environment. And that's one reason I love the Grampians so much. The Grampians Lakes, Wartook, Fyans and Belfield are good fisheries. They're very good fisheries. But the environment's just beautiful. And another thing that I go on about in the book, if at all possible, I like to fish somewhere where I've got an option, because that way, if things aren't quite right with your first choice, it's only a sort of 15, 20-minute, half-hour drive to option B. And it really improves your chances. So classics are the grampians themselves, like I say, Wartook, Belfield, and Fines. You know, individually, those are great waters, but as a collective, they're fantastic, you know. Bullamerri and Purrumbete, same thing. You know, two really good waters that are easy. If Purrumbete is, for whatever reason, not feeling good in the morning, it's only a short trip to Bullamerri to try something completely different, and vice versa. Hepburn and Newland. In fact, a lot of the Central Highlands lakes, Lauriston and Upper Colaburn. If at all possible, I love those lakes where you've got a good plan B nearby, because your first choice isn't always the right choice. So there's a few just by default, really, and I love all of them. And they're all attractive waters. They're nice to fish. They're interesting, whatever the hell that means. I still aren't quite sure. I mean, you could argue that Hepburn isn't a scenic wonder of the world, but it's got something, you know. And maybe I'm biased by some of the fish I've caught and seen there over the years, but it's got promise. Even though it's a broad, shallow, weedy water that's often sort of windswept, and it's still got some sort of wild appeal to it. So it isn't necessarily about spectacular mountain ranges and crystal clear water. It's not that simple, but there's no doubt that for a water to be on my list of favourites, it's got to have something about the fishing environment that's on top of the fishing, if that makes sense.
Yeah. You've talked about your book a few times. You mentioned it. Do you want to talk a little bit about your book now?
Sure. Well, look, I'll just very briefly, rather than trying to flick through it on screen, I'll share. Let's see if we can share the screen, and I'll just whiz through a little PowerPoint, and let's see how that goes. Can you see that, Steve?
It started screen sharing. Or wait.
Not yet.
Pop up.
Yeah, screen sharing.
There we
You've
go.
got the
Little boys there.
got my son.
Yep.
Great. So, I'll just give you a little quick tour of the book. So that's the cover, obviously, which I'm pretty happy about, at Lake Wartook, with Max hooked up to a nice rainbow, actually, not a brown. And see if I can actually. Oh, here we go. Might do it better. Oh, yep. So there we go. So there's the contents, and I don't expect you all to read through that, but probably the key takeaway here is I've broken Western Victoria up into 7 districts. It's not quite as neat and tidy as catchments, although some of them are catchments. But that's how I deal with it going through the book. But before I do that, I talked a little bit a moment ago about my sort of passion to try and get people to enjoy places the way I do. And I know that when it comes to fishing the Western Victoria, and there is some good stream fishing, but lakes are probably the main game. And a lot of fly fishers that I meet and chat to struggle with lakes. So by contrast, with fly fishing northeast Victoria, I didn't feel quite so, I didn't feel I had quite the same challenge in converting people to the fact that you can actually catch a trout in the Stevenson River, or you can actually catch a trout in the Delatite. I mean, there were things I could tell them at the beginning of the book about what might make that process easier. But with lakes, it's almost like trying to convert people to a new religion because they're daunting, you know. I remember my first lake trips and just standing on the shore of Tullaroop or Hepburn and looking out on this vast expanse, no runs, no pools, no overhanging tussocks, no bubble lines, and thinking, where the hell do I start, you know? And there is, I talk about this a lot at the beginning of fly fishing Western Victoria, but there is almost a mindset thing to get through. And of course, you know, I'm a obsessive, about lakes as well as the streams, but you know, I say trust me, it's worth making the effort. But it is an effort. You know, you can't just seamlessly go from the Stevenson to Hepburn Lagoon. You've got to think about your expectations and your approach and your confidence. I know that's a bit of a bit of a feedback loop there. If you're not confident, you haven't caught a fish, then how can you become confident without catching a fish? But I talk through all that. And then there's the really practical things you can do. Your gear. You know, I hate, I'll say it, I hate people using light tippet, or at least I hate people using light tippet who care about whether or not they're going to land a big fish. I catch my share of big fish, but I tell you, it's not because I'm the world's best trout player. It's because I'm always thinking to myself, on rivers to some extent, but on lakes invariably, you know, what am I going to need to land the biggest trout I'm likely to encounter? Not the average trout, the biggest trout, right? And so I'm always thinking, how thick and strong can I get away with? Because if I hook that 8-pounder, I want to have a fighting chance. You know, I hate being broken off. You'd think I would have grown out of it, but I haven't. There you go. Hand up. I don't like being broken off. Some people sort of, oh, well done, spotty adversary. You know, we'll meet again next time. For me, it's I sort of start smashing things. And likewise with backing. God, I had an experience guiding a few years ago where a guy turned up without any backing, and as the 6-pound rainbow at Millbrook sort of pogo sticked out across the lake, I said, how much backing have you got, Peter? And he said, none. And so when he had about 1 coil left, I just grabbed the line because I thought, you know, we're going to lose fish anyway. We may as well not lose $100 worth of fly line. And ping, off it went. And I sort of went for a little bit of a wander and collected my thoughts. And when I sort of felt I could speak again without a torrent of abuse, I said, Peter, why don't you have any backing? And he said, oh, I didn't think you needed backing for trout. So you don't need backing until you really, really need backing. And here's a tip. Spend the $10 and put some back, put 50 or 100 meters of backing on your reel. And if you use it once in your life, I promise you, it'll be $10 well spent. Unless you don't care about losing fish, in which case none of this applies to you. But I do. I don't like losing fish. So, and I guess, Steve, you know, it's not easy to hook a fish in the Western Victorian lakes as a rule. So when you do, you want to have a fighting chance, I reckon, of landing it. Mm. And the third thing, so we've done the backing, we've done the heavy tippet and good tippet. You know, spend big on tippet. Buy the best you can, because get the finest, strongest tippet you can for your money. You know, it's still going to be the cheapest bit of gear you've got, that 1 meter of tippet. It the spool might have cost you $30 or $40, but it's going to last you, you know, a dozen trips. So just spend money on the best tippet you can, which will be fine and strong, and get advice from, you know, I've got my preferences, but I'm not going to tell you here because I'll overlook some good stuff. And the other thing, get yourself a big net. It's Father's Day coming up. If you've got a little tea strainer and you want to fish the lakes, I'd rather you didn't even carry it. You know, there's nothing worse than watching someone kind of trying to juggle a trout that looks like an armed robber with about 3/4 of the trout out of the little tiny Stevenson sort of Huon pine tea strainer, and the trout's sort of like a bank robber, you know, for a brief moment before it sort of flips tragically back into the lake and snaps the line. Get a net that's going to accommodate the biggest trout you're ever likely to catch. And just like that backing, if you need it once in your life, you'll think it's the best money you ever spent. And it's not that hard to carry a net that big on your back compared to a net that big. I can tell you because that's what I do. I carry a big net all the time. I want a net that will give me an advantage if I hook a 20-pounder. I've never done that in Victoria, but if it does happen, I'm in with a fighting chance. If I've got a tea strainer, I've got no chance. And please don't tell me, oh, I beach them. So you're 30 or 40 metres out into Lake Wartook up to your chest, and you've got 10 metres of tea tree scrub between you and dry land. You're not going to beat your fish. You can beat your fish when you can beat your fish. And if you want to try and grab them by hand, good luck. Yes, it can be done, but it's not really the percentage way to do it. Again, if you don't care if you lose a fish, ignore all that little rant. Anyway, let's keep moving. I talk a lot about fisheries management, which I'm passionate about. People who know my advocacy with fisheries over the last 20, 25 years will know I'm terribly committed to wild trout in northeast Victoria, and basically looking after the habitat and the fisheries regulations ahead of stocking. That stocking is sort of a last resort thing that often doesn't work and sometimes does harm. Well, you can almost flip that 180 degrees for Western Victoria, because it's all about, on the lakes at least, very good stocking. And there's a lot to stocking. I won't bore you with it here, but you can read about it in the book. BFA do a lot of good things. There's some things they could do better though. Leaving all that behind, I then talk about, I give an overview. I try to sort of describe where the stream fishing, what stream fishing there exists, and give a bit of a description of the different kinds of stream fishing, like the quite unusual stream fishing you get around Warrnambool with those big pooled, deep, often weedy streams that are quite different to the sort of streams, again, that we're used to in northeast Victoria, as well as there are a few worthwhile freestone streams, if you like. But again, largely I talk about the lakes and how in this overview, what you can expect to find, say, if you're in the Warrnambool district or somewhere else. Then I go into the detail. That's those 7 areas I talked about.
Yeah.
Little mud maps at the start of each chapter, just to give you orientation. I figure in this day and age with Google Maps, etc., there's no real advantage to me having 100 pages of maps in the book. You can work that out yourself. And then down to the nitty gritty. 2 things. One is reliability. I've decided back when I wrote Northeast Victoria that that's a really important thing for an angler who's new to a water. Trying to work out, just, you know, is this a really, you know, if I go there and I don't catch fish, is it me or is it the water? And there are some lakes that you know, reliability is at best fair, and then there are lakes like Lake Wendouree, like Lake Wartook, which I would rate Purrumbete, I think. If I don't give it excellent, I give it very good, that are very reliable waters. And now I'm at pains to point out that reliable doesn't mean easy, but it does mean that on any given trip, it's pretty likely that fish stocks and water condition are not going to be the problem. That doesn't mean there's anything wrong with you if you can't catch a fish, but the circumstances are reliable and consistent. And then there are lakes like Deep Lake here, for example, which it literally dries up or comes so close to it every few years that the fish can't survive. So there's no fish there. So that in itself hurts the reliability. And when it's not dried up, it has water quality issues at times. So it's a good lake when it's good, but reliability isn't great. By the way, some people will be a bit surprised at waters that I don't include, like Bolac or like Lake Burrumbete, which can in boom years fish well, but that's the problem. Reliability-wise, they rate poor, and so they didn't make the cut. My standard is, would I send a visitor to these waters at least some of the time? And if it can't make that bar, then I left it out. So, and people may disagree with some of my exclusions, and they may even disagree with a couple of my inclusions, but you know, that's okay. That's just the way it is. More of the same. See, Kanong Watong, I give very good. Tolondo, I'd love to have given it more than fair, but let's face it, it's probably a once in 2 year fishery at best these days, and it's all to do with water. So when Tolondo's had a good head of water for a couple of years, it's a great lake. But that's a rare, that's not something you can rely upon year in, year out. And that when to fish, which I should have shown you, best time to fish, of course, it's a generalisation. I mean, some of these waters mostly fish best during those months, but occasionally they'll surprise you by fishing well outside those times. But they're good parameters when you're trying to decide where to go. And so we did a table at the end. That's one page of it to give people some idea as to, at a glance, it's June. Where can you go? Or where should you think about going? And all the little X's tell you. And there's an index at the back, needless to say, of the individual waters. So that's the book in a nutshell. You can buy it at the Fly Fisher, and you can buy it online. Or actually, did I put the? Actually, yeah, I did. Hang on a sec. Sorry. Anyway, if you go into the Fly Fisher online shop, you'll find it. It's pretty easy to find on the sort of almost on the home page at the moment. So just click on the link and the shopping basket, and hopefully it'll be on its way very soon after. I know people that ordered it. It came into the store on Friday, and I've spoken to a number of people who've got their copy already. So it seems Australia Post seems to be showing a little bit of mercy. For how long, I don't know. Mm-hmm. So yeah, it's available. It's available now. Gee, if you ordered it today, would it get out there in time? I don't know. If you work in the CBD, are you allowed to walk into a shop? I don't know. Anyway, I know they've been frantically trying to mail out the existing orders and new orders, and they're going okay. But look, it's just a COVID thing. So yeah, under normal circumstances, you'd have no trouble just walking into the shop and buying one. But at the moment, I think it's mail order only. Not living in Melbourne, I'm not sure exactly what the nuances are, but that's what I understand.
Oh, well, you can get your kids to give you an IOU or something for Father's Day.
That's right. You can say that the book's in the mail. Yeah. That's it. If you haven't ordered it already. Yeah.
Fantastic.
So yeah, that's the story with the book.
Good stuff. And you had a second PowerPoint that you want to show us?
Oh, look, I just had a few flies, Steve. Okay. When you felt like you wanted to talk flies,
yep.
I will try and find, just bear with me. I'll try and find, I escaped from, hang on, sorry. Hopefully you don't lose me. Bear with me. Because I know you're interested in flies.
Well, that's been quite good. I'll have to give the fly fisher a call tomorrow.
Yeah, just bear with me. See if I can pull this up. It's not much, but I thought it would probably work a little bit better than just trying to hold flies up and show them to you.
Yeah.
So let's see if this works. So can you see that by any chance? Can you do share screen? Hang on.
Let you know if it works.
Not seeing it yet.
Soon?
No. Damn it.
That's okay.
Hang on. Now let's see. I'll share screen. Sorry about this, everybody. So now can you see it?
Nope.
Oh yeah, it's starting. Something's starting.
Yeah,
yep. Here we go.
This is in anticipation of one of your questions, Steve.
Yep.
Which was 4 favourite flies.
Yep.
So, I cheated, but I'll go through them if you like.
Okay, that'd be great.
So that's the boring but good woolly bugger family. So like I say, I've cheated a bit because they're all woolly buggers, but there's 3 different ones that I sort of thought to myself, if I was without each of these, I'd be a bit nervous. And look, the characteristics I like in a woolly bugger, I like to have at least one with a little bit of flash in it, and a bead for fishing deep and slow. So I'm thinking steep shores of Tullarook. I'm thinking certainly fishing in amongst the trees at Belfield and off the steep shores at Belfield. Something that's going to get down fairly quickly and it has a little bit of flash and it's just going to stand out a little bit on a dull day. Emu Woolly Bugger. That's a fly that the great late Muzz Wilson showed me, and I've caught a couple of my best fish on that fly. And the beauty of it is, it's quite a bulky fly, but unlike a lot of bulky woolly buggers, it doesn't spin because the emu is so soft. So it really moves through the water beautifully. You can imagine it pulses and wiggles like crazy. And that's just a lovely little sort of Mark II variant that John Clulo ties and I sort of gratefully use. Again, you know, not too much hackle. And this I prefer in quite small sizes. So often people think of woolly buggers as their big, dirty, wet, but it need not be. I know Jim Jackman ties a beautiful little black woolly bugger. It's tiny. It's sort of one step up from a midge, and it's a great little fly. Actually, at Lake Fyans a few weeks ago, I had a great big orange monstrosity on the point, and this little tiny black mini woolly bugger on the dropper. And this lovely rainbow came cruising along the shore. We were Polaroiding, and it just looked straight through the orange monstrosity and just came up and casually inhaled the little black Jim Jackman mini woolly bugger thing. So that was quite endearing. That's wet zonker, a very fine sparse zonker fly, and that too is a fly that is one of my favourite flies for when trout are smelting. Those of you who've read my stuff over the years will know that I'm quite sold on the Gary Borger and Greg French idea that when trout are smelting, they select the injured and sick minnows over the healthy. So exact imitation may not be the go. And one of the things that happens when minnows get sick or injured is they lose their ability to manage their chromatophores, the cells in their skin that enable them to change colour in response to change of light. A very important strategy to have when you're a bait fish and everything's trying to kill you. You want to blend in as much as you can. And one of the things that gets disabled with those little fish, and if you ever doubt it, next time you can clearly see a big school of minnows swim past, whether those be Galaxia or Australian smelt, look in amongst those translucent, lovely, clean-looking fish, and I'll guarantee you, if it's a big enough school, you'll see a couple that just leap out at you because their colour's wrong. You know, they've got dark blotches on them. And Greg French told me that when him and Rob Sloan were doing surveys of the Western Lakes to see which had trout in them, which didn't, way back in the 80s, I think it was, one of the ways he had a fairly good guess straight away was whether the minnow schools had many sick minnows in them. The Galaxia schools had many sick Galaxias in them. And if they had lots of sick Galaxias, he knew there were few or no trout in that lake. In the lakes with healthy trout populations, the wounded, dark, blotchy Galaxias never survived, or only survived in tiny numbers. So you might not think that's the perfect colour for an Australian smelt, but for whatever reason, that fly is bloody good. The tie in detail is in Australia's Best Trout Flies because I put it down as one of my 6 favourite flies. So if anyone's got that, you know, there's the tie's in there, but it's a fairly simple fly. Stick caddis we've talked about. Important point, if you're going to have stick caddis, have a darker one and a light, or several darker ones, several lighter ones. We now believe that the colour of the case is a function of the building material that's available. So when the weed's dying, particularly in autumn, they're building their cases out of pretty dark uninteresting looking weed. But when it's healthy and growing strongly in spring, late winter, early spring, and perhaps into summer, the colour can be a lot brighter, and the fish, believe it or not, do care and do notice. I mean, some days it doesn't matter, but some days, and here's someone, I'm a bit of a sort of, you just got to fish your fly well rather than worry too much about the fly. But I'm someone who has been converted to the idea that at least at times having those two basic colour schemes, a sort of a lighter green and a darker browny colour, is well worth having. And there's the Millie down the bottom there. Don't know if you can see that when I run my arrow on it.
Yep.
And little red super glue buzzer. And look, you got to have some little ones like size 16s or heaven forbid size 18s, because sometimes even the very biggest trout care about them being puny. And it never ceases to amaze me after all these years how easily trout can find tiny food if they're really interested. We think, oh my God, a fish is never going to find that, if it's not smacking their face. But I've seen fish move 2 meters for a size 18 red buzzer. And I've seen them find it virtually on dark, in dirty water with 1 foot visibility. So you just got to have some small ones, because sometimes the real ones are small. Now, again, I could go on and I could go on and I could go on. I haven't got my claret carrots down there. That's a really, really good fly to have in your box. A dry fly. You wouldn't use it anything like as much as you'd use those, but it's a really good fly, and a nice, generous claret seal's fur body to give it buoyancy. That's its strength. You can pull a claret carrot and it won't sink, and you can hang a fly underneath it and it won't sink. And of course the Mayfly patterns, and that's an endless list. But you've got to have, when the Mayfly appear in mid-spring and maybe again in mid-autumn, you've got to have some skinny claret or brown nymphs. Skinny being the operative word. Lake nymphs are much skinnier than river nymphs, and the trout do care sometimes. And you need to have some possum emergers. If you could only have one fly in a dun hatch, it'd be a possum emerger. Doesn't always work, but it works more often than not. And again, some light ones and some dark ones. Shaving brushes are great if you can tie them well, which I can't. And good old parachute emergers. Just a nice brown parachute emerger is a very good fly to have too. And the last fly that I'd feel really naked without in my box is a Damselfly Nymph. And long and skinny is the go with Damselfly Nymphs. And my favourite Damselfly Nymph, if I could pick just one, is actually a commercial tie that Jim Allen put me on to, called the Living Damsel, the fulling mill tie. Now, the good tyers amongst you would have no trouble copying that. And I think, again, the tie is in Australia's best trout flies, but the Living Damsel is a terrific Damselfly Nymph. It's got a really long, almost crocheted tail. Yeah, you can buy them, or if you're clever enough, you can tie them. That's a great Damselfly Nymph. Catches me a lot of fish at Hepburn Lagoon. Catches me a good number of fish at Mirrabul. It's a good searching fly, actually. If nothing much is happening, if you can't find a smelter and you can't find a midge feeder and there's not much to cast to, just carefully searching with a Living Damsel is very effective. But look, I say that particular pattern, but so long as it's long and skinny, I'm happy, and a bit wiggly.
Yeah.
So there's flies.
Yeah, thanks, Phil. That's given us something to tie up over the next few weeks. We're still going to be in lockdown.
Yeah, that'll keep you busy for a fortnight or so.
Yeah, that'll keep us busy. Yeah.
You want me to stop sharing that?
Oh yeah, I guess you can.
Everybody got what they needed.
I've done a print screen of that, and I'll maybe the guys want to do a print screen and paste it to a Word document. Yeah, so that'll be good to tie. I think last week we tied up Rumpy's damselfly. It's really very fine. It's got a nice little damsel pattern. It's really skinny.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. And look, I'm seeing questions pop up, and I'm not deliberately not out. I'm noticing them in the corner of the screen. But as you said, Steve, I'll wait. There's some great questions. They've all been great questions. So
yeah.
yeah.
Now you mentioned
Oh.
Chippet. How do you set your leader up with your Chippet?
Really basic. So I've never been too fussy about my leader setup, but I start with a 9-foot 2X. This is in recognition of my love of heavy tippet. A 9-foot 2X tapered leader, shop bought, because I like as few knots as possible, especially for lake fishing, because I think knots are catch points for algae and detritus, much more so than they are on a stream, but that's just me. And that's my platform. I almost never fish one of those leaders straight out of the box, but I add to it. And the beauty of it being 2X is I can add 3X or 4X in, 1 foot, 2 foot, 3 foot, and I've got a leader that's ready to go. Whereas, of course, if it was a 5X leader, none of that would be possible. So that's my basic leader. For the leader tying fanatics out there, that's probably disappointing to hear. That works, and you get a lot of mileage out of your leader before you then have to replace it, because all you're doing is replacing the last few feet. And mostly I'd be using 3X and 4X, which is in the tippet I use is 7 pound and 8 pound. If I'm forced to use those size 18 buzzers, I might go down to 5X. And if I'm fishing a, size 8 woolly bugger, I'll use 2X because I can. And on the tippet I use, if you hook a fish on that and it runs into a pile of logs, you'll literally snap the hook before you'll snap the tippet. And I speak from experience. So, 2X is good. I don't use it all the time, but it's nice to have it up your sleeve when you can use it. Of course, it's a function of fly size, really. That's probably the thing that really defines how heavy I'm happy to go. If I'm using a tiny fly, I obviously can't go tying it onto 2X. It's going to look like it's stuck on a bit of fencing wire. But if I can get away with it, I do, because I don't like being broken off.
That makes sense. Yeah. You're also mentioning there about Polaroiding. Do you Polaroid by yourself, or is there someone else that's higher up on the bank? And
that's a great question, Steve. On the lakes, it is always best with two, because the best Polaroiding tends to be on the Western Victorian lakes. Not Wade Polaroiding's not so good. You can do it. You can do it on the eastern shore of Purrumbete. You can do it in some of the shallow bays at Hepburn, and everything's just right. But by and large, we're up high looking down. So when you're on your own, it is a disadvantage that you see the fish and then you have to go down to sort of like ambush it. Can be done, but it's certainly a heck of an improvement if you've got your good mate, 10 metres or 20 feet up the bank on those steeper shores looking down. That's a really good point, actually. Yes, you can do it on your own, but a friend really makes it easier. And you work as a team, take it in turns, be nice and even-handed about it. And the beauty of that high elevation Polaroiding is you don't need a blue sky day. You don't need bright conditions. You just need reasonable clarity. Because the higher up you are looking down, the better the more refraction you take off the water. And it's quite remarkable what you can see. I was fishing with a mate at Hepburn last week, and it was a full cloud day at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and he still managed to Polaroid a good fish about a metre off the bank because he was up so high. So it's remarkable what you can see if you've got elevation. So yes, as a two-man job, it works really well.
Thanks, Phil. You've been great to listen to. I've got heaps and heaps of questions to ask you, but it's monopolising things. At this stage, guys and ladies, if you have any questions, we've got question time now. If you've got any questions, pop them into that chat section, and what we'll do is we'll read out your name, and then we'll unmute you, and then you can actually ask the question if that's okay. Is that okay with you, Phil?
Yeah, that's fine. Can you read them out to me, or do you want me to open them?
I've got them here, and I'll get down to
Right,
the.
that's good. That's good. Yep, perfect.
Look, I'm going to ambush this question. The Ant-Man asked the question. I didn't ask the question. He said, "Thanks, Phil. Sticky buzzer combo has been my go-to at Millbrook." I'm going to ambush it anyway. What's the sticky buzzer?
What was that? Sorry.
What is a sticky buzzer? You mentioned it in Millbrook.
Two flies. It's two flies. Sorry.
That was sort of a Frankenstein fly that I think Ian or someone came up with that tried to combine the qualities of both. If my memory serves.
Oh.
Yeah.
I do have that, but I did mean the combination of a stick caddis, sticky.
Oh, okay. Yes. So
with a buzzer.
Yeah. So the each way bet of fishing both, and yeah, that's a really good combination of flies. When it's bright and flat and you're searching, or you can see the occasional fish, but you don't want to sort of alarm them, fishing those two little flies is a great way of covering your bases. Yeah, no, love it. Nice slow retrieve, figure eight. I'm sure everybody here can do a figure eight retrieve, but there's such a difference between a figure eight retrieve and a strip retrieve. I'd catch 80% of my fish on a figure eight retrieve versus a strip retrieve. Trout like it easy, you know. They're not in it for the sport. They just want to make a calorie profit. So you make it easy for them most of the time. Occasionally you can excite them into taking a fly, but mostly you just want to make it easy. Yeah. And the other great thing about really slowly retrieved flies is Peter Morse once told me he managed to spook a metre-long barra by pulling a little tiny baitfish pattern at it. And obviously that never happens in nature, that little 2-inch baitfish charge metre barra. And so he said, you know, you can't attack fish with your fly. Now, if you're stripping a woolly bugger and you have the misfortune for it to be coming at a trout, there's a very good chance you'll spook it. Because, yes, as Pete so correctly says, you can't, in nature, little fish and little yabbies and things don't attack big fish. They flee them. But with a little pathetic stick caddis and super glue buzzer just chuffing along at, you know, 1/10 of a kilometre an hour or whatever it is. Yeah. My maths isn't my strong point. So I became a fishing writer. But you know what I mean. Like if they're going so slow, it doesn't matter if they're coming at the fish. They're sort of pathetic, really, which is just the way something looking for a calorie profit is likes it, I dare say. And you know, with midge, you've got to remember three times the calorie, 3 times the protein of steak in a midge.
Yeah.
So nutritious and slow and stupid. Perfect.
Should make burgers out of them.
Yeah, that's right. Well, I think they do in Africa, in the Rift Valley. If they catch enough. Yeah.
Now, there's a question from Steve and Marianne. Steve, would you like to ask that question?
Sure. They might have nodded off.
Okay, the question from them is, what size for Jim's mini black woolly bugger?
Yeah, we just want
Sorry, we're on
mute then.
We're on mute. Yeah, what sort of size when you talked about the mini woolly bugger? Because I've always thought woolly buggers are generally larger sizes.
No, Marianne, definitely not. So yes, they are of course very useful and probably best known for their large sizes, but you can time down to size 14 easily. So I'm talking, 30 mil. So they're pretty small and they work very, very well at that size. A mate of mine caught a 5-pounder in Tullaroop a couple of days ago on a size 14 humongous.
Okay. And
when I say size 14, I'm talking, the total length of the fly would be 30 mil.
Okay.
So not a tiny hook and a great big long tail. It's a small fly. And so I love having some little woolly buggers. Woolly buggers are popular for a reason. Now they really are a very enticing conceptual fly, which is why there's so many variations of them. The only things I don't like in woolly buggers basically are overdone hackle, because it makes them spin in the water. In the quest for size, this is just me, but in the quest for bulk, sometimes people put a really big hackle, which is fine if it's something soft like emu, but if it's actual, hen hackle, it just makes them spin in the water, which I don't like, and spin when you cast for that matter. So yeah, other than that, I reckon go for it with woolly buggers. The permutations and combinations, especially if you start moving into the world of magoos, are just endless. I probably aren't quite as taken, for no really good reason, with the really long-tailed woolly buggers, but that I freely acknowledge that that's just me, and there'd be plenty of competition fishermen who'd say I'm mad. But yeah, other than that, yeah, I think just go for it. Put beads on them, put a bit of flash in them, have some drab as can be. And look, I'm even using purple ones now, having decided that that's a very prominent colour in yabbies, which are in many of the lakes that I've talked about tonight. No trout in its right mind will go past yabby if it can catch it. Yeah. Thanks, guys.
Okay, next one. Ian the Ant-Man has a question about Polaroiding and a few other bits and pieces. Ian, do you want to ask that question, or has it been answered?
No, was that the one about the psychology of it almost, Ian?
He needs to unmute himself if he's not unmuted already.
Sorry, I was mute. The few occasions I've been fishing with you, Phil, you seem to have some sort of superpowers at spotting fish. I'm just wondering if there's any sort of tips you can give the immortals.
Well, I wish they were superpowers. It's probably just a misspent life, Ian, I think, is probably part of it. A few things. The first one is I'm quite convinced that Polaroiding ability, by and large, is not innate. It's not something that some people are naturally more gifted at than others. It's very much about practice. I know some very, very, very good Polaroiders who have reasonably technically poor eyesight. So it is practice, and I think good Polaroids are important, and the most important thing for trout Polaroiding is that they not be too dark, because in most of my Polaroiding is not done under ideal bright blue overhead sun conditions. Certainly not in Victoria. Often it's overcast, often it's early or late in the day, so you want as much light as you can get, not as little. So I'm really big on Polaroids that also admit a lot of light. And a sort of yellowy, orangey tint is good for that. So your glasses do matter. They've got to be comfy, and they've got to not fog up. And that's often a function of frame, how it fits your face. The more you shade them, the better. So hats and caps are worthwhile. But I think the big hurdle to get over with Polaroiding is to try and mix efficiency with covering a lot of water, because most of the lakes that I fish don't have vast numbers of fish. They don't have a fish every couple of meters. So you've got to recognize that seeing nothing in 100 meters is no failure. It's just a way of lakes that the fish just might not be for whatever reason in the 100 meters. So you've got to be able to scan the 100 meters quickly, but effectively. And the process, I suppose, that I use is I look for anything that might possibly be a trout, be that a shape, a movement. Was that a funny flash I just saw? I'm not certain. But then trying to basically disprove that it's a trout. So rather than waiting until I see something that I'm sure is a trout, I look for anything that could possibly be a trout and then inspect it further to find out whether it is or it isn't. And probably on average, 9 out of 10 things that I look at that could possibly be a trout aren't. But that's good because it means I'm hopefully not overlooking things that actually are a trout. So having seen that strange shape, is it moving? Sometimes you need a reference point, you know, is in relation to that log, has it actually moved? Because if it's rough, that can be hard to tell. Is it really a trout shape, or is it not really the shape of a trout? You know, now on closer inspection, nah, trout aren't that shape. Its aspect's wrong. Is that flash of white or color, is that a submerged beer can, or is it actually a trout? So you basically, that, I guess that's the pattern that I follow. So looking from, can it possibly be a trout? No. Oh, what about that? No. That one. Yeah. Oh, hang on. Oh, geez, it is a trout. It's moving. It must be one. So that's the process. It's not as if I've got X-ray vision and I can sort of see the goldfish in the bowl that nobody else can. It's just looking at it from that point of view. And look, I know it's tough, and I talk about this a lot in the book, but you've got to believe you're going to see one, which is really tough when you don't see one. But then when you finally do, you'll be okay. You'll say, bugger me, this works. But it's seeing that first one and catching that first one is really, really important.
Thanks, Phil.
It
It's
does
really
investment. It takes a lot more. All of this takes a lot more investment than catching a little rainbow and a parachute Adams on the Stevenson River, which, by the way, I love. Right? There's no criticism of that whatsoever. It's just the expectations are very, very long way apart. So when you get out of the car at Tolerant Reservoir, you can't get out of the car with the same mentality that you do when you're pulling up on at one of the bridges on the Marysville-Buxton Road to fish the Stevo. It's not going to work because your investment is going to be greater, but you don't catch too many 7-pound trout in Stevenson, or at least I don't. So that's probably the trade-off. Yeah. Does that help?
oh, really helpful. Thanks, Phil.
Great.
Thanks, Phil. Marion, Polish Rooster has got a question for you.
Hi, Phil. Thanks for sharing your knowledge with us tonight. I've just got a question. Have you ever fished the Lake Fyans fly-in competition, and how did you do?
No, I never have. And I fished one competition when I was 12 years old on the Barwon River, which I won. And I thought I'll quit while I'm ahead. And I have never fished in a competition since. Look, I've got, this sounds funny, I've got a lot of my great friends are competition fishermen. And I can absolutely see the many benefits in skill development that competition fishing brings, but it just isn't for me. What can I say? That's just the way it is with me. I'm someone who enjoys fishing with maybe one good mate, 2 at the maximum. Yeah, that's just how it is. And I like having control over a lot of things that competition fishing wouldn't give me control over. And again, I understand completely that being forced to fish a particular part of a lake on a particular day in particular conditions is going to improve your angling. I don't doubt that. But for me, I like to make the decision about where I'm going to fish based upon those things on the day, rather than having it sort of imposed upon me. So that's just me. Yeah. So no is the short answer. I've never fished the fly-in, so we'll never know how well I do or otherwise.
You're always welcome to come down.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah.
Yes.
Thanks, Phil. Thanks, Marion. Do we have any more questions, guys and ladies?
Yeah, Phil, do you use Chippet rings with your lake setup?
No, I don't, Ross, but I wouldn't argue against it. I can see many advantages to tippet rings. A lot of my clients and even a couple of my mates have started using them in the last few years, and I can see the advantages. So I guess the reason I don't use tippet rings is probably just pure habit. But it's a habit I wouldn't try to discourage it. So long as you're not so good, yeah, I don't see why it shouldn't work. It probably increases the life of your leader. So yeah, no objections.
I've got a question.
Yeah.
How do you fish? How do you tackle par and beat fishing below the quarry and fishing from the bank?
I really invest heavily in trying to see a fish. I don't rely upon it entirely, but I'll do a lot of walking trying to either pole-roid a fish if the light's right at water level, and I know that's not easy, but I do it. I do it successfully at times. I usually wade out as far as I can and follow the milfoil, looking back along and into the shore. And in the morning, at least, you usually have good enough light to have a fighting chance to see them before they see you. More commonly, I'm probably looking for their disturbances when they chase bait fish, or, you know, otherwise swirl. And mostly I think the ones I see are chasing bait fish in one form or another. And yeah, I just cover a lot. Par and beat, I really feel I get rewarded for putting the effort looking for fish. I certainly get them fishing blind, and I will fish blind sometimes whilst I'm looking. I talk a lot about this in the book. It's sort of this hybrid between blind searching and looking and listening. But I really try hard. If I find a fish smelting, and it's usually around the weed bed, I reckon there's a fair chance I'll catch him eventually. So I might only see 3 or 4 in an afternoon, but I would be hoping I'd catch half of those.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks,
Along
Phil.
that quarry shore. I mean, there's plenty of other things like the Carixia feeders in early December, and the fish moving along right in close at first light and so forth, but stock standard. And up in the marsh, I sometimes see them smelting there, and they're all over the place in the marsh at the southern end. But that's a bit dodgy, the wading down there. Sometimes that's easier from the boat.
Okay, thanks, Phil. That's been great. You've been very interesting to listen to. I have so many more questions to ask you, but I'm going to have to wait for another time. For those of you who want to ask some more questions, you might want to check out the Fly Stream forum. This is a well-moderated site, and the one you keep the closest watch on for questions that appear. It's free to register, and I note this is the best place to ask away. With some luck, we might catch up with you on a river or a lake somewhere. We appreciate the time and knowledge you've shared today. I think we'll wrap it up now. Thanks you very much for giving us your time tonight, and we all hope to see you soon. Thanks to Red Tag for hosting the event, and to everyone who's joined us this evening. Next week we have Scott Xantholakis, and the following week Jonathan Stagg from Tasmania. So thanks a lot.
Thanks
Phil.
very much, Steve. Thanks,
you.
mate. And it's been a pleasure being here virtually. We only had a couple of little glitches, so that was comforting. So yeah, thanks again for the invitation, and really enjoyed chatting.